And they were on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them. And they were amazed, and those who followed them were afraid. And taking the 12 again, he began to tell them what was to happen to him, saying, "See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and to the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles. And they will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him. And after 3 days he will rise." And James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to him and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, "What do you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant us to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left, in your glory." Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or to be baptized with the baptism with which I am to be baptized?" And they said to him, "We are able." And Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink, you will drink, and with the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or at my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared." And when the 10 heard it, they began to be indignant at James and John. And Jesus called to them and said to them, "You know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. But it shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many."
Amen. There's a national study, and this is not going to be a surprise to any of you. It's a confidence in leadership study. Apparently, they do it every year at Harvard, at the Kennedy School of Government, and I could actually only find the 2012 version, so that's 11 years old now, but I'm guessing it's way worse than this now. But it's this survey, or it's this idea about confidence in leadership. And here's the results of the 2012 survey. 69% of Americans think that we have a leadership crisis in the country today. I think it's probably higher than that, right? 70% agree that unless we get better leaders, the U.S. will decline as a nation. 68% disagree with this statement. Overall, our country's leaders are effective and do a good job. But 81% of those surveyed feel that the problems we face today can be solved through effective leadership. Well, that's probably true too, because the whole politics thing is heating up again, and people are taking sides, and it's getting nasty, and always has been nasty. But is it possible that our elected leaders could benefit from reading the verses we just read this morning? Is that a possibility? I think it might be. So Jesus is talking about servant leadership. This is what he's discussing in this passage with his disciples. And so that's what I want to focus on today in just 2 points. And here's the first point: why the leader must serve. And number 2, the degree to which the leader must serve. So why the leader must serve, and then the degree to which the leader must serve. So here's why the leader must serve. Let's talk about history for a minute. And just bear with me. Historian and theologian Robert Bauckham did a series of lectures in which he compares and he contrasts what has been coined as history from below, or a people's history, with what he calls history from above. So he says that traditional history is history from above, which he defines as the perspective of the ruling elites. He says, this is his quote, "From antiquity onwards, history proper was political and military history. We counted it as the doings of the ruling class and from their perspective. In such history, the common people appear only as an anonymous mass." So I think if we look at traditional history, you may disagree with me on this, and it's okay, just keep listening to me, if you would. If we look at traditional history, you don't have to look too far to see that it's true. I think in my own education of American history, I got very little about how Hispanics helped to form our country. I got very little about how black slaves contributed to the overall nature of our country, or contributed to the shaping of our country. Mostly American history is about the wars fought, the people in charge, the writing of the Declaration, and I'm not demeaning that at all. It is true part of history. It's a true part of history, but it's only one perspective. There are some voices missing in that. So there's been this entire movement to change this, which is called a history from below, or synonymously a people's history, which is actually a history not just, it's actually a history from the perspective of marginalized people, of people that didn't do anything outstanding in national terms. And so now the fight is on, of course. People have accused those who engage in this writing as revisionist history, because it comes from a very different perspective. Now, I'm not here to comment on whether it's revisionist or it's not, because there are flaws in all writing of history, because it's written by flawed people. Every single historian that has ever written anything writes it from their perspective, or at least from the documents that they see and their perspective of the documents. And so they're all flawed to a certain degree. They're all flawed. History from below, there probably is some revisionist history going on, but there's also skewed perspective in traditional history. Each of them offer only one point of view. But here's the point I want to make. This is why I'm talking about history. The Bible doesn't fit into any neat categories, anything. But by and large, the Bible is a history from below. By and large, the Bible focuses, especially New Testament things, but the Bible focuses on the common person. It focuses an awful lot on the marginalized people. At the same time, the Bible has a deep respect for authority. It has a deep respect for authority, so it doesn't fit neatly into anything. But if you look at Jesus, he was walking with the marginalized, the disciples, the women, and they were regular people. They were fishermen and farmers and shepherds and even tax collectors who were loathed by the religious class. So the really amazing thing about the Bible is that not only does it talk about the perspective of the common people, but it's essentially a book about how God himself came as a marginalized person. Jesus was a marginalized person, and he walked among the marginalized. I think we have to look at that and see that it's true. He didn't come as a royal. He certainly could have if he had wanted to. So this is so important for what Jesus is teaching his disciples. So what's going on here in our passage? Well, John and James come to Jesus. Now in the Matthew version, it said their mother comes to Jesus. So I don't think they're contradictions. John and James were there, even if the mother was asking the questions. They were there approving of it. Maybe they thought it would be softer with Jesus coming from their mother. But the idea here is that this is their idea. And what do they want? They ask Jesus if they can sit at his right and at his left when he comes into his kingdom. The term here in Mark is actually into his glory. The term in Matthew is come into his kingdom in the same telling of the story. But the idea is the same, his glory or his kingdom. But they have completely misunderstood Jesus' mission. They think he is coming to establish a geopolitical kingdom. And they want power and importance because this is their view of leadership. When you become a leader, you become important. You get power. And they wanted to sit at his right and at his left, which means they would be second, maybe second and third or co-second in command. They think that God's kingdom is exactly like every other kingdom they have seen. It's about the ruling class. It's about position and status and power and wealth. It's about comfort and all the trappings of leadership. It's about what you can do for me since I am so important. Who doesn't want that? I want that. Don't you? We'd never admit it, right? But we love to be seen as important. But if history has taught us anything, it has taught us that this way of doing leadership simply doesn't work. Sooner or later, when you get power, it will corrupt. So no matter how much they pay attention to the people, at some point there's a downfall because leaders make it about them. It brought to mind, to me, the story of Beethoven's Third Symphony. Just bear with me here a second. I thought of it in the recesses of my mind those 30, 40 years ago when I was studying this stuff. So it was composed between 1803 and 1804. And it was just after the French Revolution took place. So the French Revolution was at the end of the 1790s, and this was very early in the 1800s. And what's interesting is that musicologists point to the opening theme of the first movement of the Third Symphony as the beginning of the Romantic period in music, because it uses this chromatic stepwise. Don't worry about that. It's not important for my sermon, but it's this. So it's, just bear with me. Da, 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 da. You hear that? That's a half step there. That wasn't done before. That's not classical. That's now moving on into the Romantic period, okay? So it was innovative, and innovation was in the air. The revolution was happening, the people's revolution. Napoleon had come and he was against the aristocracy. And he wanted to down the aristocracy because it was about the people. It was about all of the people. And so, see, Beethoven wasn't in favor of the aristocracy. He was one of the very first freelance musicians in Vienna. Well, Mozart had been freelance before him and had been pressured so much, to join a court, because that's where musicians made their money, their living. They were in some nobleman's court and they composed for things. Mozart tried to make a living. It didn't go well for him. But Beethoven was making a go of it. He was against the aristocracy. And so on the score of this symphony he dedicated it to Napoleon Bonaparte. And then Napoleon declared himself emperor. And he ripped out the first page and he rubbed out the name Bonaparte there. And he called it Eroica, right? He wasn't going to do that because Napoleon had just gone against all of the principles. You see how this works? Why do I tell you that? Even Napoleon, who was the head of the revolution for the sake of the people, and now he declared himself emperor. This is the way that leadership normally goes in the world. Of course, that didn't last either. Napoleon eventually was exiled. That revolution didn't last either. So when the other 10 disciples heard that James and John had asked Jesus this, they were extremely angry. You could think of lots of reasons why they were angry, but I actually think that they were angry because they hadn't thought of it first. They also want to be important. There's loads of times in the scriptures where it talks about how they were walking along discussing who would be the greatest among them. This is what they did. You know, they're dreaming. Jesus is the king. We're waiting on him. I don't know what he's waiting on. I don't know why he's taking so long. And we're just walking these roads. Of course, he's doing all these powerful things, but they're sitting back talking to each other. Who's going to be the most important in the kingdom? Because that's what they want. They are thinking geopolitical. They want the same thing. A whole band of men that wanted power and all the trappings of power. So Jesus calls them together. And he says to them in verse 42, and Jesus called them to him and said to them, you know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them. They have that typical mindset of leadership. I'm the leader here, you follow me. Of course, the moment you say, I'm the leader and you need to follow me, you've lost them. You've lost them. Because it doesn't follow the principle that Jesus outlines here. And he says, but it shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant. And whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. The only kind of leadership that will truly last is very different from what we see. It's a leadership that is not served by others, but a leadership that serves. Good leaders are those that give themselves for the people that they lead. They're interested in the good of those people, and they will do whatever it takes to see them prosper. Speaking at Nelson Mandela's funeral, Ms. Joyce Banda, she's the president of Malawi, shared the most profound lesson she had learned from Mandela about leadership. This is what she said. I learned that leadership is about falling in love with the people and the people falling in love with you. What is so interesting about Jesus is that none of the powers that be in his day paid attention to the marginalized or the wayward, to the sick, to the lame, to the blind, to the down and outers. But Jesus came as one of them. And he lived among them and he healed their diseases and he went to their homes and he gave himself beyond tiredness. He loved and served the people, even though later they would reject him. That's the call of leadership. That's why we need to serve, to be leaders. Because if we don't serve, it doesn't last. It doesn't last. Number two, the degree to which the leaders to serve. So in our story, James and John ask Jesus if they can sit in the places of prominence in his kingdom. And here's Jesus' response to them, verse 38. Jesus said to them, you do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink? Or to be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized? They have no idea what he's even talking about. Even though he has just predicted his death in the most clear way that he has up to this point. I mean, he just puts it out there and says exactly what's going to happen to him. He says this in verse 33, "See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles, and they will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him, and after 3 days he will rise." What part of that didn't they get? How obvious do you have to be? Can it be any clearer? And Jesus is referring to this when he asks them if they can drink the cup that he will drink and be baptized with the baptism that he is baptized with. So these two terms, the cup and the baptism, are actually terms used frequently in the Old Testament for wrath, for God's wrath. Let me give you a verse for each in the Old Testament, just a representative verse, because there's a gazillion of them. Let me give you this. This is Psalm 75:8. "For in the hand of the Lord there is a cup with foaming wine, well mixed. He pours out from it, and all the wicked of the earth shall drain it down to the dregs." Woo, that's pretty intense right there about the cup. And here's about the baptism. Psalm 69:2, "I sink in deep mire where there is no foothold. I come into deep waters and the flood sweeps over me." This idea now, the word baptism, okay, it can mean immersion and it can mean other things too, which we hold to. And this is not a talk about baptism right now. I can give you all the Presbyterian verses for it, okay? But it does at times mean to be, when it's talking about wrath, it certainly does mean completely submerged, overwhelmed with the fury of God. So this is the terms that Jesus is using, the cup and the baptism. Can you handle this? But the disciples are clueless because there are other meanings for these things. Like consider Psalm 23 verse 5. "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows." My cup overflows. And baptism for them might well have signified the purification of the baptism of John, right? This is the way to misunderstand things. They were thinking in other ways. So they say to Jesus, "Oh, sure, we can do that. We could, the baptism in the cup. Oh, that's awesome. Bring it on, Jesus. Yeah, is that the only thing that means that we get to be on your right and on your left?" And Jesus obviously knows that they misunderstand. And he says to them, "The cup that I drink, you will drink. And with the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand and at my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared." His Father would grant those things. So what is Jesus actually saying to them? He's saying, believe me, guys, though you don't know it, you will have to endure all kinds of things for my name. You have no idea what's coming yet. You have no idea, but you will. There is a price for leadership, and there's a price in knowing Jesus. There is a price in following Jesus. It's to share in his sufferings. This is what the Bible tells us over and over and over again. And we know James was beheaded very early on in the history of the early church. He was beheaded. John wasn't, he was one of the few that wasn't a martyr, maybe the only one that wasn't a martyr, but he went to prison. He went into exile. He suffered all kinds of things for the name of Christ. See, here's the thing. Good leaders are willing to suffer for their people. That's the extent of it. It's not just to serve them, it's willingness to suffer. They are willing to suffer for the people. They're willing to do whatever it takes for the people that they lead to flourish. Whatever it takes to make the people they lead to flourish. So who of us has been that kind of a leader? Oh, man. Who of us has not been caught up in self-centeredness, in self-protection, in self-defense? in self-justification. It's a terrible problem. It's a terrible problem. Who is up to such a task? And of course, this is where we have to look to Jesus. He knew exactly what he was saying to his disciples. He had come to serve them and the people around them. Back in there's a very interesting passage in chapter 6 of the book of Mark, of the Gospel of Mark, where Jesus, he's been working for days, and he's exhausted. He's exhausted. And so he says to the disciples, get a boat, and we're gonna ride out across the lake to the other side so we can get some rest, so we can take it easy. And so they get in the boat, but people get wind of it. They hear that he's going to the other side, and they run around the lake to the other side. And obviously they beat them there. And when Jesus gets there, there's this huge multitude. He's exhausted. But it says that when he looks at them, he has compassion on them, and he sees them as sheep without a shepherd. And so what does he do? He serves them. He goes and he just keeps going. He keeps going. And then there's the feeding of the 5,000. All of this happens at that point. See, this is Jesus constantly sacrificing himself for them. But of course, the ultimate for Jesus would be that his prediction would actually come true. That as verse 34 says, he would be mocked and spit on and flogged, and then he would be killed. I mean, this was actually, he knew this was coming. He knew that he was in for this. And on that cross, it would actually get worse. It would get worse. Everything I read in the Psalm about the foaming cup of God's wrath would be what would be hurled at Jesus, for in the hand of the Lord, there's a cup with foaming wine well mixed, and he pours out from it, and all the wicked of the earth shall drain it down to the dregs. Jesus drank it to the dregs, the wrath of God. And he did it for us so that we could flourish. See, that's a leader. Not only did he serve the people, but he gave his life for us so that we might have life. And yes, we will have to drink a cup and endure the baptism of suffering, but it will never be the wrath or the baptism of God's wrath. It will never be the wrath of God that we will have to drink to the dregs, because Jesus took it for us. Now we drink a cup that remembers his suffering. Brothers and sisters, do we want to be a church that leads people into the kingdom of God? We're going to have to think differently about leadership. We often are very impressed with the wealthy and the popular and successful people. I know I am. But the Bible is a history from below. It's a history of the common people, of the marginalized people, the average people. It's a history of the nobodies of the world. Can you imagine if you're trying to prove the resurrection to people in the day of Jesus, that the first ones at the tomb were the women? They weren't even allowed to testify in court. If I was going to write a history and make it believable and prove all the apologetic arguments, I wouldn't have started with the women. Except that it was true. He had reached the marginalized, the demon-possessed, the sick. Of course, there were some wealthy people among them. It was people from all strata of society. But here's the thing that they had in common. They were willing to give up everything to follow Jesus, and they were willing to serve one another. And with them, God changed the world. That's what he did. Why would it be any different for us? Why wouldn't we be able to change our corner of Greenville and beyond? In his book, Leading at the Edge, Dennis Perkins tells us this story. Ernest Shackleton led a daring expedition in 1914 to reach Antarctica. A year earlier, a lesser-known Canadian-led expedition headed in the other direction to explore the North Pole. Both ships, the Karluk in the north and the Endurance in the south, found themselves trapped by solid ice packs. Each crew was faced with a fight for survival. But the outcomes of the two expeditions couldn't have been more different. In the north, the crew members from the Karluk, led by Jamor Stephenson, degenerated into a band of selfish, mean-spirited, cutthroat individualists, ending in the death of all 11 crew members. In the south, Shackleton's crew faced the same problems: cold, food shortages, stress, and anxiety. But his crew responded with teamwork, self-sacrifice, and astonishing good cheer. In the end, each leader stayed true to his core leadership values. Stephenson valued success above caring for the people. He consistently communicated his ultimate objective, getting to the North Pole. In Stephenson's words, this meant that even the lives of the crew are secondary to the accomplishment of the work. To the very end, Stephenson denied that his drive for success led to a tragedy for himself and his crew. In sharp contrast, Shackleton's leadership focused on the value and dignity of his teammates. At one of the lowest points of his trip, Shackleton wrote, "The task was now to secure the safety of the party." The well-being of his team drove him to put others first. Shackleton even gave away his mittens and boots and volunteered for the longest night watches. By valuing each person, Shackleton forged a team that was willing to share their rations with each other, even on the brink of starvation. Through his example of sacrificial leadership, Shackleton was able to accomplish his ultimate objective, saving the lives of his crew members. Brothers and sisters, I don't know. I don't think I could do that. Maybe you feel like it's too much to think about that, or even to look at Jesus' example of sacrificial leadership. But see, this is the thing about the gospel. It comes in and works against all of the strong inclinations that we have in our hearts, and it begins to mold it. If we ask him, if we look to him and say, he died because we're not good leaders. See, that's why he died, because we couldn't do it, because we couldn't get it right, because we're not serving one another the way we should. He died for us. He forgave us. He put it away from us so that now we can come and we say, my life is in him. Now I can serve you. See, this gospel begins to change us. If we ask him, if we let the Spirit work through us, Jesus' goal was to save a people for himself, save them from their selfish leadership. And he would stop at nothing to save them. Brothers and sisters, is this just old news to you? Then maybe you haven't seen the desperate situation that you're actually in. The gospel is actually good news, and it really does change everything. Let's pray.